Welcome. This is The Realm of Ideas is Free to All, episode 67, Models as Generators Process. So, we are now engaging in close to our 100th video. And this is a kind of like series of ruminations that I do with my partner, loved one, and wife, Julie Rauer, about our work and our connections with other individuals, kind of in our interdisciplinary little world. So, tonight we're going to talk about I'm going to talk about the model as I understand it in my work, and Julie's basically going to talk about her suppositions in relation to the concept. What we've done is we've kind of set up a series of conversations where one of us will have a topic and the other one will basically engage in that topic as well. So let me start off with how I came across this. One of the things that I started to understand and appreciate in my architectural education was the fact that there was a certain primacy of drawings and models that was underappreciated in the process of generating artifacts. And I found as if it was this very strange hybrid between these kind of like very kind of abstract, almost kind of non-architectural kind of diagrams that people used to kind of generate the internal structure of their organism. And I kind of found that, kind of like somewhat insipid. And I also found that it didn't really lend itself to the provocation of kind of activity. I felt as if, we were basically taking a collection of static things that were not questioned, similar to what Whitehead was talking about in relationship to the idea of being and becoming. I didn't understand the relationship and the analogy at the time because I hadn't been fortunate enough to come across Whitehead's thinking. But what I think happened was I came to understand the fact that these artificial applications were then adorned with some kind of window dressing. And I found that this was kind of like at the expense of the idea of actually kind of creating kind of what I would call architecturally provocative artifacts, which is something that would kind of like allow us to generate some kind of conversation about the nature of activities. Now, by activities, I mean, we know the idea of kind of drinking water and kind of walking and running and conversation and the activities that we engage in that we then put within our architectural edifices. But the idea was, I came to understand that architecture being a noun was such that we create architecture, but the art, the edifices themselves were not provocative enough to kind of engage in the creation of new combinations or new activities. So over time, I started to kind of understand the fact that there were people who had kind of started to kind of move in this direction. And I feel as if like, an architecturally kind of organic circumstance was something that would kind of be able to move in that direction. So I started to realize that the drawing and the model themselves had a certain provocative character that could allow for this to take place. Now, what I've done is, as a result, kind of move towards making that happen. And next week, we're going to talk about the idea of models and drawings, a symbiosis of models and drawings. But tonight, we're basically just talking about that circumstance as it relates to models. So anyway, let's go back to the piece that I kind of brought up on Wednesday from Whitehead's Science in the Modern World, The Century of Genius, which beautiful book that Julie had gotten from me that I hadn't had. And I basically enjoyed kind of reading it. In fact, I think that these two particular chapters, The Century of Genius and the one before about mathematics in the history of thought, are probably my favorite chapters. Anyway, so Whitehead says, "You'll observe that I do not hold induction to be, in its essence, the derivation of general laws. It is the divination, the divining of some character of a particular future from the known characteristics of a particular past." Okay, so in this case, what we usually see this idea that an inductive method is kind of come to understand generalizations from the specific, so that these specific discoveries kind of may give rise to a general rule. Whitehead is kind of suspicious of this, and for good reason, because he sees the fact that these things don't always apply. And the idea is to understand that this application isn't a static thing, right? In what's happening is in a process where things are becoming, they're stable entities that will then become unstable. So therefore, it's not as if these are universal truths, which is also true because they're not completely formed, right? So the wider assumption of general laws holding for all cognizable occasions appears a very unsafe addendum, correct, to attach the limited knowledge. All we can ask of the present occasion is that it shall determine a particular community of occasions which are in some aspects mutually qualified by reason of their inclusion within the same community. So the idea is, in this temporal circumstance, right, you understand that the moderate stability of the circumstance of the community depends on the fact that this is the model, this is the frame in which you have to look at it. So as a general introduction, using that, now we talked about the difference between induction and deduction. We've talked about the idea of the analogy between that and the model as an inductive aspect. And I think one of the things that I think I was saying to Mr. Spock is the fact that one of the things that I think slows us down is this understanding of models. Models are basically suppositions about systems. They're not complete, and then they never can be complete. And I think that's one of the things that I think scientists kind of tend to struggle with, because they try to make them complete. One of the things that I think many people have talked about is the fact that one of the things that holds science back is the fact that they have a fearful relationship with speculation, when in fact speculation is that thing that really is the part that allows them to have these leaps of faith, that allow us to kind of see these paradigm shifts, that allow us to kind of overcome that inertia that ultimately ends up holding us back. Anyway, with that said, let me introduce the most important part of the show, which is what's new in Julie.
That's me.
Yes, it is. Hi, P.
Hello.
Hi, P.
Hello.
Hi, P.
Hello, all.
Okay.
Been quite a day. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So, what
tell
is
us.
new? Many things are new. Oops, I'm just going to sit on this because I have a compact middle.
You have no middle.
No, it's
Oh,
compact.
now you're the same height.
See?
Good.
Isn't that magical?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I completed my lichenology drawing today at the Met to a small crowd. So thank you for those who are our new Art Science Complex subscribers who were there upon my completion, signing and dating of my original drawing using the metaphor of a 13th century multi-headed Cambodian Southeast Asian sculpture as the metaphor for the third hidden, now revealed fungal partner in lichen. A lichen, for those of you who don't know, is a compound organism, an entity, sorry about that, which has always lived as a symbiotic creature. It was thought that lichens were basically a two symbiosis generated organization. It turns out that it was a threesome, not a twosome. So everyone thought that lichens were a couple melded forever, which is rather a beautiful and lovely and romantic biological thought. Turns out lichens are a small crowd, and that the hidden organism that nobody saw till 2016. And Bruce, would you like to hoist up my completed drawing? There is a lot of, I think that's a very extreme angle. I'm not sure.
Trying to guess there's no glare.
Oh, maybe closer up, I think.
Then I don't see the whole thing.
Oh, well, okay.
Trying to get in the screen.
Okay. And then we'll zoom in for close-ups because I have rendered and created quite a bit of detail, as you can see. So, that's good. So the third partner is actually a basidiomycete yeast, which I have drawn at the very crown of the third head of the third entity. And even though this is actually in a four-headed Cambodian sculpture, I take many liberties because I'm not trying to render the art. I'm not trying to do a photographic representation. I use the art and the artifacts at the Met as springboards for my own imagination. And for these transformations and transfigurations, which I use these pieces for. So these are instruments for metaphorical visualizations of real information and real research and new discoveries across the biological sciences, in this case, mycology. Hang on.
Right. Well, what I was saying today was I think that one of the things that happens is we've all seen the idea of when natural processes or natural systems will impose themselves on artificially created things like a church or statue or sculpture, and they will erode it. And that kind of like false relationship of the fact that the stone was crafted into a head or face becomes revealed as kind of a false relationship, as the nature kind of basically sees it as limestone or sandstone, and therefore kind of takes on the natural process by which it kind of like absorbs that material. But we were thinking about the fact that what really is interesting is that, like, in the surrealist nature by which the particular transfiguration, right, of things can project the potential of the illusion of nature into what it could conceivably provoke. So in that case, I think that that was the kind of thing we were kind of talking about as a kind of extension of some of these things that that we're looking at. Right.
Sure.
So
I'll just zoom in for some close-ups. Actually, I think this is working. You can see the close-ups. Okay. So you'll see actually the three entities that compose lichens, which actually are extremophiles, meaning lichens can exist in pretty much every environment on the planet, whether it be incredibly cold, incredibly hot, incredibly dry, incredibly moist. They are wildly adaptive. And why is the basidiomycete yeast? Why did I show it just at the top? Because, like the research itself, like the discovery itself, these are only contained in the cortex, or the very thinnest uppermost outer layer of the lichen, which is why if nobody looked there, that's why nobody found them. They are not in the body, and they never were, and they still are not. They are a protective armor, as if we were wearing an invisible suit of armor that no one could see, that protected us from everyone and everything. Rather an appealing thought at this moment in time, actually.
Yep, quite. Right. Okay, yep. So with that said, let's move into the body of what we'll be talking about. So
our favorite tea.
Yes.
Tea is tea.
My situation is I want to kind of talk about the nature of the model and its pleasantly provocative speculative value. Now, like I said, I mean, in the case of a model is a representation of a system or systems or operations. And as a result, it never fully kind of becomes transparent with the reality that it is modeling. It's basically a supposition. And I think the idea is that supposition has tremendous potential. Now, as Whitehead was saying in terms of induction, the reality is trying to understand the proper the proper way by which these communities of articulations can take place is really the kind of thing that is the opportunity for the individual when they're constructing. So an example I brought, and this is kind of funny because everybody says, "Hey, we always see Julie's beautiful work. We never see yours." And I said, "Well, that's because my stuff isn't beautiful." But the point is,
It
I
is
kind of
to
think,
me.
no, thank you, Pete. But I thought to myself jokingly that, let me illustrate this idea. Now,
That's a great idea.
yeah. Now, like I said, what I found was architectural models when I built architectural models at school. And if you look up at the top here, you can see some of my other
Oh yeah,
models
there
of
are a
the
whole bunch
series.
of models
There's a
over
whole bunch of
there.
them, yeah. But the
Yeah,
point is,
and in
I
back of
found
your
that
head.
like architectural models were there to um, ingratiate themselves, or let's see, is that the problem? Maybe that's not the right. Architectural models were there to kind of like make the case for an organization from which the models never contributed and the
They were
drawings never
very
contributed.
tantalizing, I thought,
I thought
in
so.
many
Yeah. So I
cases.
think the
Yeah.
point was like architectural models had their own spirit, their own character, their own potential, but it never really was exploited as
Mhm.
such. And as a result, I always felt that that was a shame. So what I started to do was kind of start to isolate the model as a series of operations, and some of the kind of preconceived ideas about models, which was that it was basically just all glued together and it had no real construction capacity, was something I wanted to challenge. So I came up with a series of kind of rules, and I made a series of guidelines, and I basically operated within that system.
You show. I'll move this
So
to the side.
here's an example of what I mean. What I made was what I would call strands or worms or strings, and I kind of had a series of pieces. I would call them. I made the point of saying they could be 1 inch high, and they could have folds or facets that would be anywhere between 1 to 2 to 3 inches long. And I started to look at their interconnectedness. I started looking at the shapes and started to see how they could combine. Now, one of the things I found about this was the fact that they had this kind of like pretty intricate kind of stack, but also what I found was they had this enfolded in the operation. They had this really interesting symmetry in terms of the kind of series of connectedness. Anyway, what I did was we had seen this beautiful show at the Met, and there was a series of, I guess, ojimes, right? That were kind of like
They were inrows.
Inrows, right? The inrows,
which had a toggle,
right?
Which
Which is, yeah, the ojime is the toggle. Anyway, the inrow tower it was a series of these pieces that were kind of put together to make this kind of
a necessary, which is the toggle.
Right. Now, it was somebody who worked for Tiffany, wasn't it?
Oh yes, it was actually, I'll think of his name. He was the basically head of design for Tiffany for 30 or 40
and
years.
He'd collected this incredibly beautiful beautiful collection.
Yeah,
and great. We looked at the inrows. There was some splendid inrows, and I kind of thought to myself, what an idea to kind of like let's take this idea of like in construction. One of the things that we'll have is something we call post tensioning, which is basically once we kind of have something complete, like a slab or a wall or a kind of a tower, they will actually kind of compress. They'll actually stretch the tension. They'll stretch the cable to increase the tension and allow that to kind of compress the building together, either to kind of make the slab stiffer or to make it, like to make something more rigid.
I can go look up his name.
So yeah. Okay, so anyway,
I have a whole.
If you notice, like what happened was, looking at these pieces, is the pieces themselves, right? Were, if you stack them, they very easily can topple, right? Because they're kind of just kind of set on top of each other. So my intention was to make a series of models that actually were with no glued connections, so they could have, so what happened was here's a particular model, and I have the kind of the stack, but now obviously this would not, if it wasn't for the post tensioning of these pieces, I wouldn't be able to kind of tilt it. And you see that kind of this slip connection at the top. Oh God, I can't. That slip connection at the top is what allows for the post tensioning. So these pieces that are in between are held in place by, you can see it's kind of like somewhat jiggly because it's not, there's no mechanical connections. They're basically just kind of held together like the inrow, right? And here's another one. This was interesting because what happened here was we started with a model that came from a drawing. So Julie provided me with a drawing, which I have here, right? And Julie provided me with the drawing. I said, oh, let me see from which I can make a tower. So I kind of then created this tower. Let's see if we get the two kind of in the same situation. Let me see, tilt that up. All right. And then you kind of see the two. And that was kind of how we kind of started to kind of think about the idea. And you sort of kind of see the way in which we constructed it. Also, if you look, there was also the intention of taking the pieces and seeing them, kind of. So the idea was to kind of open them up to kind of see the interior. So what from the drawing, then there was, and we'll talk maybe a little about this, and this might be a good example to bring back for next week, was from here we have a point of view, right? But then what has to happen is in the creation of the object, there's the other things that follow consistently within the system. So we saw this kind of tripartite configuration that had this kind of curve. And then we thought about the placing of where the structural elements would be, and then thought about the fact that what would be the organization internally. So in this case, the drawing basically determined the way in which one would create. And then we found these other kind of things that we, did, we started to kind of think, okay, what's the back of it look like? What's the front of it? Now, what happens is at certain points, I could probably take these images, we could take these perspectives and do drawings of this to kind of further the development of the object. So that's kind of what we're talking about. But you see, because of the fact that I saw a provocative nature to this, I kind of had the ability to kind of follow up on it. But this drawing is done by Julie. This isn't my drawing. It's basically just it's just a provocation towards that which I felt I wanted to introduce. So what I felt is that starting to understand how in which I would basically be able to proceed. Now, again, like I've said, you can see up here, there's kind of a whole, I think there's like 15 models of this series that have used this kind of in-row tower as a kind of a springboard. And you can see, I mean, this is held together not by glue or any kind of mechanical fastening, but just simply by the post-tensioning of the strings used in tension to hold the piece together. And then there's this kind of slip joint at the top that kind of holds it fast so it doesn't fall apart. So I think given that idea of that analogy, it was something that allowed me to kind of make a series of different kind of permutations and iterations. And I kind of feel it was kind of like a scratching of the surface of what we could start to do.
His name was Edward Seymour.
Oh, okay.
And he was the design director of Tiffany's. I have a lot of photos.
Perfect.
Look it up.
So given that, particular investigation, I think that there's, anywhere other investigations that could take place. But I guess the main thing that I'm kind of moving towards is the idea of the architecturally provocative artifact, which is that, this is basically an analogy of a kind of post-tension in-row structure, which is not a building, but basically alludes to the idea of some kind of artifact. Now, again, you can elaborate and iterate this particular object and kind of create other perspective as well, that you can kind of see how the string kind of fits really underneath and kind of goes up, and kind of like Julie likes them. They look like kind of like bunny's ears, from Tumble Down Bunny.
Yes, because don't we love Tumble Down Bunny?
Everyone loves Tumble Down Bunny.
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's basically that's the beginning of the idea of emancipating the model as a generator, so that the provocations and the perspectives that it alludes to become the way in which one proceeds in terms of generating form. So.
Okay. We get to lunch.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to talk about the scientific and biological and organic aspect of what Bruce is talking about. I think it's a lovely pendant piece to what Bruce just showed you all. His models, which are quite ingenious, especially because, and he, I'm sure, mentioned this, They don't use tape or staples or glue,
No.
and they're held together with a great deal of articulation and precision. So I will start by discussing the maquette.
Mm-hmm.
So the maquette, for those of you, and I've tried this out on a few people. Most people now do not seem to know what the word maquette means, and it's a very important word for anyone who goes to a museum and looks at sculpture, looks at architecture. It's basically, so what a maquette is a prototype. So this applies to any kind of a design, whether it be industrial, architectural, engineering, drawing, painting, ideas in science. So a maquette is a three-dimensional sketch or scale model, a rough draft of a work, a rough draft of architecture. That is obviously a French word. The Italian term is bozzetto, which sounds like a fascinating shape of wriggly squiggly pasta, but it
Or a
isn't.
biscuit, little
Or
biscuits.
a little biscuit.
Mm-hmm.
I would go for anise flavored
Mm-hmm.
bozzetto, which is
Mm-hmm.
always good.
Mm-hmm.
So a maquette is used to visualize and experiment or test ideas and forms, reading from my original notes, without the creation of a full-scale structure or sculpture. It is the three-dimensional sketch version of a pencil or graphite sketch. In painting, it's called a cartoon. Not that we don't love Looney Tunes, we love
Bugs Bunny.
Looney Tunes and Bugs Bunny and Chuck Jones and Michael Maltese and the gang. But a cartoon in the classic sense is a very quick sketch, often done in paint, of a painting that is not.
All right, which actually, like,
Yes,
is very
actually,
easily kind of
yeah,
like, yeah. I mean, so in
that
fact, I
is.
mean that, yeah. And we'll talk about that more next week in terms of the
Sure.
symbiosis between drawings and models. But I think one
Sure.
of the things I want to kind of just say quickly is
Sure.
it is a temporary, as opposed to like the idea that's a classic idea of a representation of a system. It is in fact a temporary state in terms of my understanding of it being something that is existing for a
Mhm.
moment on its way to kind of being
Mhm.
itself, but it has an independent and life of its own. That was all. I just want to
Okay.
interject that because I
Thank
so I
you.
didn't get
Okay.
lost later.
Thanks. I'd like to discuss quickly, and I'm going to move quickly on to model organisms, which is the
Mhm.
main point. But I just want to quickly, since everyone loves a root word, if you don't, you should. So, the interesting root words of the fine art cartoon, the maquette or model for a painting, is from both the Italian cartone and the Dutch carton with a K, which interestingly and fittingly are terms for heavy, strong, forte, strong, which means paper or pasteboard. So the terms for the one dimensional cartoon sketch are, in fact, the words for the very material used in architectural models and maquettes. I find that fascinating.
And interesting the fact that like
Very
in fact that
interesting.
folds and kind of like cuts, become cartons. So I
Well,
mean, wonder if like
yeah,
the
they're.
word carton.
Oh,
I don't
I'm
know if the word
sure.
carton is related to that because it kind of
Probably.
again uses the similar material.
Yeah, it's
But I
made of
think this
heavy,
this
strong.
idea of a speculation,
Mhm.
you know, and its incompleteness, right? Its
Mhm.
temporary state, is the piece. What I find is what we should kind of focus on because that's where
Mhm.
those perspectives are. That's where
Mhm.
those provocations become.
Mhm.
I mean, the architecturally provocative artifact is one that's not a single thing, but it's a
Mhm.
process by which, through this symbiosis,
Mhm.
you can start to see potential
Mhm.
for the further iteration and evocation.
Right. Okay.
Go.
Let me quickly go. I
Mhm.
don't want to lose
Mhm.
all the time here. So there is also the Italian modello, a preparatory study or small scale model for a work of art or architecture. That was relative to a patron because they couldn't understand anything. This was to show them. So,
Right.
anyway, moving quickly on. So the model in nature, these are what I consider living, breathing maquettes. And I think this is a fascinating and quite compelling idea. These are genetic speculations, my term, actually. These are really epigenetic tests in the laboratory of the natural world. So, for those of you unfamiliar with the term model organism, it's an incredibly important term in all branches of the biological sciences, particularly genetics. And model organisms are prototypes, living prototypes for their species. And I'm going to give you quick examples because in this case, it's very important. I think specificity goes a long way to explaining complex concepts. So, Arabidopsis is a small flowering mustard plant. That is the model plant used in almost every single experiment in genetics, in flowering time, in reproduction, in morphology, observable shape and physical form. In terms of a nematode, C. elegans, it's a nematode, that's a model organism. This is nature's process of evolving morphologies, functions, and potentialities.
Can I say?
Sure.
I mean, in this case, I mean, every organism is a model organism. It is in that it is a temporary state.
Yeah.
But in this case, these are used because of the particular genetic profile having tremendous analogical and metaphorical potential in terms of combinations, in terms of life systems.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay. The reasons why these are model organisms are quite specific. So these organisms are used for their speed of replication, their clarity of gene expression, their very legible, readable genetic profiles, the very readable, understandable, almost transparent cell biology, their cell division processes, think rapid and lucid, and their behavior. So they are not going to use a species that takes 9 months to gestate. You will never find an elephant as a model organism. Absolutely not. You will not find a person as one because they take too long to produce generations. So model organisms in genetics are species, non-human entities, which are thoroughly studied to comprehend the biological processes, and they are selected for traits like rapid reproduction, a diminutive scale, meaning you can't have a laboratory full of elephants. It doesn't work. You can have thousands of flies and keep them in a small box. That works incredibly well. You can have a bowl of nematodes. Just don't add strawberries.
Okay.
So it's for ease of manipulation. And these are recognized model organisms, and I'm bringing them up because they are living maquettes, like E. coli is the model organism for prokaryotes or bacteria.
Yeah, so I think another thing I see is the fact that, like, one of the things I think throws us off the track is a lot of the times we look for the completeness of knowledge, or we look for the completeness of transparency between our model and our the object that under study. I think what's more important is the structure of the ideas that connect the pieces that we actually understand. So I think in that case, the structure of the ideas, the structure that holds the pieces together and makes them possible of kind of creating useful, valuable analogies and metaphors is much more important than actually having all the pieces.
So. Yeah, should I continue?
No, yeah. I just want to say that, make that quick interjection.
Sure. So, another key example for single celled eukaryotes is budding yeast. So, model organisms are very mind expanding. And I'd like to stress these ideas really call upon one's imagination because this is not, and none of these are seen through a human lens. And this is incredibly important. Almost everything that people see, they lens through their own experiences. Everything, whether it's emotional, physical, historical, psychological, none of these model organisms are human by design because humans don't fit the model. So humans are not used, and this is a very paradoxical point. Humans are not used as their own maquettes for research that circles right back around for human application, for human use. Almost all of this information that's being gleaned and gathered and experimented upon in model organisms, thank you, are being applied to human problems, human foibles. How's that for interesting?
No, it is
But
interesting
none
because
of the models are human.
no, but that means
Yeah.
that's because the profile has potential. It's useful,
Yeah.
right? So the thing is, the reason why we use certain things and not other strains, because we actually, again, will then kind of like purify certain strains. And by purify, I mean just basically make it more capable of having specific analogies to the humans that we're studying through them. So the thing is, like I said before, it's the structure of the ideas or the structure of the information that is more important than actually having all the information. So I think it's like that's the kind of thing that we kind of strive for. And what makes these profiles beneficial or useful as opposed to other ones is the fact that they have that potential, right? Whereas other ones may not, or they may be less effective in that case.
Thanks. Shall I
Mm-hmm.
proceed?
Yeah.
Now, this is a point that I think is very key when you are visualizing complex information as regards architectural models. What if you suddenly have a violent alteration of material substance, meaning the entire, now this doesn't happen in architecture because they plan what something will be built of and constructed of, and they aren't suddenly going to say switch from brick to a mucous membrane. I mean, you are not going to have radical shifts in material substance.
You do actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll go into that later, but I think your point is valid, but I'll explain
okay.
something related to that.
Well, this is your forte, but in animal models, invertebrate model organisms, as you may know, the mouse has been the long-standing model. And if you go to neuroscience conferences and present, which we have co-presented at such, you will find aisle after aisle of mice and mice habitats and mouse food. And what is really interesting is a colleague of ours, we don't ever name names, but a colleague of ours pointed out to us, and he actually is a neuroscientist and a physicist. Would you like a pencil?
Oh.
Pointed out that the mouse model and many things that are done for a long, long time are actually not very accurate and not very effective. He said that the mouse model is spectacularly wrong and incredibly far off in many cases because it is used as a testing ground for human drugs and many treatments, genetic treatments, all sorts of things that in fact end up not working well nor at all on actual people because the mice are structurally neurologically vastly different in many key ways from humans, and the mouse brain is not a grand equivalent to the human brain. We might be better off using the plant model of maize or Arabidopsis or thale cress, which is pretty interesting. Should I move on to the residential hotel market?
Well, let me go back to something
sure.
I was going to say before. Is that
yeah.
very often and this is that there will be material changes, and it's not like somebody kind of takes a wood tower and makes it out of concrete, but there
Mhm.
have been analogies where people will simulate certain structures and other materials. But
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah.
the main point is something that we refer back to is the fact that I remember back in I think it was like when I was late 1980s,
Hmm.
someone talked about the idea of architects building buildings, and I corrected them and said, like, architects don't make buildings. Architects don't build buildings. Architects create models. And that's an important distinction, because the thing is, we sim we don't, unfortunately, as architectural students, or even as architectural practitioners, understand the structural reality of our buildings through our models. It's something that completely doesn't happen, which is one of the analogies I wanted to kind of make the
Hmm.
case in the in-row towers. I mean,
Hmm.
we used to always talk about the idea of kind of like what we called skyhooks, which was this imaginary thing that would allow this thing to happen in a model, but would never happen in real life. I mean,
Hmm.
sometimes you would see these things where you would have spans that were completely inconceivably possible, and you would see them because chipboard can span
Hmm.
at scale hundreds of feet without bending. So
Hmm.
the reality is, yes, there was that kind of the models were ignorant of the materiality of the things they represented. However, that's the idea why they are better to generate from themselves rather than to just be subservient to an organizational structure that is kind of basically kind of driving the bus. Also, I found that being creatures of pattern recognition, we were better to kind of find the patterns than to kind of like start out artificially
Hmm.
with the patterns.
Excellent
Yeah.
point.
So,
Okay. So, two fascinating things I want to make sure I cover and make sure you get in.
mhm.
Coming out of South Africa. Okay. One is a residential hotel, as it were, a residential hotel maquette built by birds. You heard me correctly. A residential hotel maquette built entirely by avians. So, sociable weaver birds in South Africa, they construct enormous, these are the world's largest, most intricate birds' nests. They're usually built in acacia trees, almost always, and they choose them for a number of reasons I don't have time to go into here, but I'm happy to on Arbor Day. So you just rejoin us on Arbor Day. These are residential bird avian hotels. When I say they're massive communal structures, they can weigh 2,000 pounds and span 20 feet wide. So, size and a Gulliver scale notwithstanding, these Weaver Nest hotels are the ultimate organic maquettes. My thoughts here. So, why? Because they shelter over 100 pairs of birds, wait for it, for up to a century. Now, think of apartment complexes, which are maquettes that also harbor other species. These sociable weaver nests harbor scores and scores of non avian species, which are constantly remolding and remaking and sculpting these models. So, the other species of animals in a self contained ecosystem, there are an architectural maquette for, just do this quick, falcons, eagles, vultures, owls, chats, and reptiles, including the Kalahari tree skink, snakes, Cape cobras, boom slangs, that's a fun name, mammals, small spotted genets, and myriad insects, including scarab beetles who live on the avian droppings, the copious avian droppings, all of which alter, sculpt, and shape this living, breathing maquette. Bruce.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, um, like I said, I mean, I think that the ways in which these things kind of are constructed, the models, is as a temporary state, but as a
Mhm.
temporary state, it gives rise to the provocations of its state as an object in process. So what I think one of the things it does much more successfully is gives rise to the idea of the evolution. Now, in the evolution of a species, the evolution of an organism, it's basically to kind of be more capable of surviving and persisting in your environment or having the ability to adapt to circumstance as they emerge. In the case of the architectural model, it's slightly different. What happens is it provokes perspectives that give a deeper insight into the potentials for the further development in greater detail of the object. So just as I showed before, we went from this kind of sketch, right, to the model,
You want
right,
me to hold one up?
as a result
Would you like
of
me to hold one up?
no. Just want to get my fingers around here. So
Sure.
to this, and then where we kind of start with we start with the similar frame
Would you want me to?
in the fact that we have the
All right.
the similar frame that we look at here, right? In the fact that we have that, but then the reality is, what's the rest of it? So we actually kind of get into the idea of using this. What are the potentials, given what we have, to what further gets exploited
Fascinating
and
on the
explored?
bottom there.
Yeah, thanks. So this was kind of like, and then again, taking the potential perspectives of this, right? What would be the drawings that could conceivably give us further depth and detail and understanding into the object
It's
itself?
a generator of portfolio.
Exactly.
after
See, one of the
portfolio
things that organic things do
Okay
is
to
they
put it
exist
here?
simultaneously at multiple scales. Architecture is incredibly bad at that. And I think it's because we don't have a process that allows us to see that. There's a very different thing from being a person standing outside of a 60-story building and looking up to being the person who's kind of in the space. But in fact, even in that case, it's way less complex and intricate and potentially laden than is, say, a fallen tree, or like you were talking about, the idea of the residential hotel that then kind of becomes recrafted. Now, historically,
for 100 years.
historically,
yeah.
architects have had the ability and have done fairly well in readapting existing structures.
Retrofitting.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's been a historical circumstance that I feel that architects have been and engineers have been fairly successful at reusing things. And in fact, one of the things I thought was exciting was I thought that one of the potentials for organic suppositions into the urban environment was to actually take these empty office spaces that I thought would be empty after COVID. And then people say, like, no, I want the people back in the buildings, whereas people were working very effectively offsite. And, I think it's more of a kind of like, I want to see what these people are doing kind of thing. But I thought the idea of, like, it would be great to kind of adapt certain high-rise buildings into farms. Now, I know that like chicken coops and vertical farms
works very well for plants.
Yeah, but exactly, because the thing is, the surfaces of the buildings had the potential, but in fact, the interiors had the potential. Just like the fact that factory warehouses became loft space. Why couldn't loft space become chicken coops or hot? Yeah, but I'm saying, why couldn't I have, in a 10-foot ceiling? I mean, couldn't I raise chickens or pigs, right? But so I thought the idea of kind of like actually making agricultural adaptations to office buildings was something that I thought might be an interesting kind of thing to do.
If I may make a note on that. In Japan, especially in Tokyo, where space is incredibly limited, they have been doing vertical farming, not of livestock. Is messy, it sprawls, it's smelly, it's noisy. Plants are not. Plants are quiet.
No, but you can contain it in interior. I mean, because the thing is, you have buildings that have very hermetic exteriors.
Yeah. But I'm saying they are vertically and have been vertically farming in Japan beans and strawberries and squash and tomatoes highly successfully.
Internal to the building or on the exterior?
Internal.
Okay.
And without soil.
Interesting. Okay.
This is vertical aquatic farming. I've seen several specials.
Okay. Well, aquatic farming, that makes sense. But I'm saying the idea of the idea of like adapting again these things. I mean, because everyone always thought like, oh well, the palace couldn't be turned into whatever it's turned into, or this couldn't be turned into that. But I think
Mhm.
we have been very inventive in terms of our adaptation of our previous
Oh, quite.
objects,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
don't see any reason why we couldn't see the same thing.
Mhm.
It's just that it seems like everyone's gone back to work, and
Okay.
there's no place to put
No.
the hogs.
Okay. I just want to make this really keep after the
Go ahead.
hogs.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Okay. So the macrotermes, which is the large, again, South African termite, macrotermes mounds on the African savanna, where it's unbelievably hot, are actually fascinatingly models of giant externalized guts, as in GI tracts. So they are an organic architectural model or maquette of a prosthetic metabolism, very important, which allows termites to decompose complex materials that they cannot digest or process themselves. So, in fact, termite mounds are verily maquettes of GI gastrointestinal systems removed from a corpus. So, removed from a body existing as a domicile, as a processing plant, as a factory, as a laboratory, as a sculpture, as an edifice. And there I leave it off.
Okay. So the
Yeah.
idea is taking the in this sense of the way in which we had models tied to their desire to kind of express the intentions of a kind of artificial organization of known activities. The idea was to actually create a situation where you could discover organizations and activities as a result of reading the model. So instead of the model being dependent, the model becomes independent and provocative. So it actually has the potential to kind of like not be stuck in the inertial static relationship between activities and their transplantation. And again, there is this very strange hybrid that exists between the generation of the actual form and the interior, which kind of seems to kind of be a kind of a skin deep kind of thing, as the fact that these kind of like artificial organizational matrices are kind of then contained within some volume, but there is very little relationship in terms of discovering either one. So therefore, the model has potential in terms of kind of being that thing that allows the vision and the imagination of the individual to impose itself on the model and further understand or further recognize organizations and perspectives. So that's
Well
kind of
said.
like, yeah, thank you, B.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's see that we have a couple minutes left. So let's see what we want to wrap this up and kind of get, kind of like final thoughts about where we are. And then we're going to kind of continue this discussion in a different vein because we're going to talk about the kind of symbiotic relationship between the drawings and the models. But we've kind of started to investigate that peripherally, but we've more focused on that generative capacity of the process of the models. So in fact, one of the things that also I kind of maybe should talk more about was the fact that in this case, a lot of times the construction of models became a kind of somewhat of an interesting puzzle for architectural students and architectural practitioners. Whereas in this case, I built my artifacts in a very specific way based on how they had to be constructed.
Mhm.
So, and in fact, I remember kind of having built my share of buildings. One of the things I felt was valuable was I actually kind of had to imagine almost the way that someone gives someone a set of drawings and then say like, okay, which is the way in which I'm going to build this project. So that was actually in a really kind of a fun possibility in thinking about the way in which these things were made. So,
Mhm. I think too, when you are considering what Bruce said, which I think is quite compelling, is when you think of model organisms, each organism has its own sphere of existence, meaning, and they're vastly different. Think of the model organism E. coli, the bacteria, a prokaryote. Its environment, its lifestyle the reality of its existence is absolutely nothing like the zebrafish, which is one of the animal models for vertebrates, and is absolutely nothing like the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, which is the prime invertebrate model organism. It's not only that they live in different realms, it's their diets, it's their habitats, how they live. They're coming into contact with entirely different building substances, building methods. Their archaeology is incredibly species specific.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So
So
basically, I
that's
think that that's
Mhm.
kind of where we are.
Yeah.
Next week, which episode 68, we're going to be talking about the symbiosis of drawings and models, and we're going to talk about that process. So we've already kind of scratched the surface on that to a degree from
Mhm.
my understanding. And I think we'll kind of go into the fact that one of the things I think that models or drawings can do themselves, but they benefit by having the other, is the fact that one is two-dimensional and one is three-dimensional. Then even though both have capacities of the other, these are specifically different elements in terms of that. I mean, obviously I can make a three-dimensional image on a two-dimensional piece of paper, and I can also do kind of like a two-dimensional kind of understanding of a three-dimensional object.
Mhm.
But the point is, the perspective that I draw with my hand on a piece of paper will only be able to kind of render and kind of understand so much. And in fact, it benefits from the model being able to kind of expound on some of the things that it kind of like starts to indicate, as well as the fact that there's a certain kind of level of articulation that can take place on a drawing that can't take place on a model. So we will start to look at the fact that their difference is, again, a kind of like, as we said initially, that idea of the fact that it is not complete, that it is a kind of temporary state, and that temporary state allows those two things to never be completely compatible, which is what creates, I think, a lot of that symbiosis. So closing thoughts, my little one.
Yes, thank you. The relativity of materials, scales, structures, and environments. Let's just mention Abbott's flatlands, which is all about a mathematical and existential relativity. These organisms all have a different relative worldview, if you will, a relationship with vastly different environments, which in fact they are all on planet Earth, but they see and perceive it in entirely different novel ways, and we don't understand their perceptions or psychology, so we don't even know how they are perceiving their own modalities, their own architectures, their own edifices, their own policies.
Mm-hmm. Well, I plead ignorance because I'm an idiot. So I mean, that's
Great.
my excuse.
Well, that settles that, doesn't
Okay,
it?
exactly. Okay. So next week, episode 68, Symbiosis of Drawings and Models Process. So as we always end, the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all. And don't forget that, for us to keep it that way.
Arabidopsis.